Good afternoon, everyone. This is David Boehm, Senior Vice President for Public Purpose and National Advocacy here at the American Association of Community Colleges. Welcome to our webinar on the draft regulations on accreditation that were agreed to in late May at the Department of Education. Very pleased and honored to have with me today four experts on the accreditation process, various aspects of it that are hopefully going to provide you with a strong sense of what these regulations could potentially mean for campuses. Apologies up front for those of you who are football or soccer fans, as those of us who grew up in America refer to it. My son is in a state of disbelief that I'm not multitasking now and watching this the semifinal. But so we planned this well before we knew about this. So apologies to you on that front. A few housekeeping notes before we get started here. I'll introduce the panelists just in a moment. We will make the slides available to you as a follow-up email, so you don't have to furiously write down the slides as we go along. I will be reading from them at a variety of points. I want to note that these are AACC slides. They don't represent the views or perspectives of the panelists. You will be hearing those as we move through the various topics. But this slide deck is AACC's and AACC's alone. The format is going to be that I will provide up front, again, after introducing the panelists, a brief overview of accreditation within the Title IV structure and its relationship to the Higher Education Act, and then a bit about process by which accrediting agencies become recognized by the department, and then a little bit about the negotiated rulemaking, which is why we're here today, and the outcome there. And then we will go through seven topics in various areas. I'll briefly outline each of those seven topics, and I will turn to the various presenters and ask them for their perspectives. As we go along on these topics, and this is not rehearsed in this respect, I will encourage the panelists to provide their perspectives other than the one individual who's going to lead things off, because there's a lot of knowledge that's represented on this call, excluding myself. With that, by way of overview, please let me introduce the panelists. We have Jennifer Bloom, who is the president of Bloom Higher Education Advising, Dean Fisher, an AACC member, president of College of Southern Idaho, Marla Morgan, who is the senior vice president and general counsel with the Higher Learning Commission, and Monty Sullivan, the ex-president of the Louisiana Community and Technical College System. And Monty, Dr. Sullivan, was also a lead negotiator for public institutions during the negotiated rulemaking process. So he was right at the table along with Jennifer, and in his case, representing the perspectives of community colleges. So Monty has a particularly valuable perspective to provide today. So getting in a little bit to accreditation, just as at the most general level in the federal government. Next slide, please, Jim. As everybody knows, accreditation is necessary in order for a institution to be eligible for this federal student financial aid programs and other programs as well. It has a sort of historic conceptual role as being one of three legs of a triad of entities that approve institutions before they can become eligible for Title IV. Accreditation is the sort of the private aspect of it. There's state authorization required as well. And then the federal government goes through a review of more the administrative and financial side of institutions as institutions are allowed to enter the Title IV programs. Accreditation historically has been about quality and determining that an institution has a minimum level of quality for students before it, again, before the institution can be approved for the programs. It's important to keep in mind too that for as essential as and central as accreditation is to Title IV, accreditation, as I'm sure all of you know, existed way before Title IV. and the Higher Education Act was created. And so it has a longstanding experience or value to institutions as simply certifying and ensuring quality assurance for institutions or by institutions for institutions. And so that's always can be a tension, if you will, between accreditation as an autonomous institutional self-regulatory process and the very large and important and legitimate role that the federal government has. Accrediting agencies, this next to last bullet in this first slide, they're recognized by the Department of Education. That approval process is circumscribed and authorized by the Higher Education Act. If you were to go to the Higher Education Act and look what it says about accreditation, you'd find that a lot of it is, I think it's fair to say, is antiquated. It's been now 18 years since the Higher Education Act was last reauthorized. And so one of the reasons why the regulations have been changed a number of times is because the HEA is a little bit behind the times. And then finally, it's the statute just outlines that there's a senior departmental official who approves accrediting agencies for recognition by the department. That's after a review by what we call NASIKI. The full name is on this slide. And Jennifer Bloom, who's with us today, is a NASIKI member, and so we have an expert who has that perspective as well. Okay, so moving a little bit more on to sort of where we are now with accreditation. As I'm sure everybody knows, President Trump has been, and his administration have been very focused on accreditation. Candidate Trump in 2024 talked about accreditation. The administration issued an executive order on this, and there's a link in, of course, the webinar slide here. A few months after it took office, in January of this year, the negotiated rulemaking process for accreditation was announced. One of the important things for community colleges, and it's been an issue for us, a problematic feature of what the current Department of Education administration has done, is that they have merged the representation of public 2- and 4-year institutions and given them a single seat. And historically, for many, many years before that, the 2-year institutions, the community colleges, as it were had a dedicated seat, and the public 4-year institutions had a dedicated seat as well. Those two seats have been conflated, combined into one. And we were fortunate that in this latest round of negotiations, as I mentioned, we had Monty Sullivan, who's with us today, representing all public institutions. But we continue to think, and we continue to let the department officials who we know, that we don't think that this is a suitable arrangement, and that we wish that they would give us back our dedicated seat. And then finally, there were 2 one-week negotiation sessions here in Washington to hammer out the consensus regulations. And that's on this next slide here, just talking a little bit very generally about the negotiated rulemaking process. And in a moment, I'll ask the panelists to provide some of their perspectives about things, but let me just continue providing a little bit of an overview for y'all. There was consensus that was reached in the neg reg, as we call it, process. Different people have different views about the outcome and the substance of the draft consensus, the draft regulations, which reached consensus. And won't go into the process more right now. Monty might want to say a word or two about that. I think most people, as this slide indicates, thought that and I personally agree with this, that the Trump administration, by virtue of setting the agenda, setting the issues that were discussed, writing draft regulations in the first instance, set the terms of what the regulations ultimately would look like. There was a lot of a give and take and a lot of legitimate negotiation, a lot of change that was made to the regulations that were initially put on the table by the administration. But as all administrations do, they set the parameters for the final rules. And it's important to understand too that in a lot of areas, and we'll get into that in just a minute, that the administration didn't need to issue regulations in Jennifer, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, really in any of these areas, but certainly most of the ones in which they are placing new requirements on accreditors and therefore institutions, they weren't under any legal sort of statutory impetus or mandate to do that. They just decided that accreditation needed some changes, and they were going to exert their preferences through the regulatory process. A little bit more about process. A notice of proposed rulemaking will be coming out. We think in the near future. We don't have a specific, date or time, but we'd expect the administration to be coming out within the near future with a formal notice of proposed rulemaking. AACC will submit formal comments on those regulations, but because those regulations were the product of consensus and neg-reg, and again, I didn't go into that process in any detail, but because there was the consensus on the rules, the likelihood of there being substantial changes to the regulations at the end of the formal commenting process is not great. There will probably be some changes. Public will be free to comment along with the AACC. The extent to which we could expect changes, I think, is limited, but I'll let negotiators, Monty, Jennifer, and others offer their perspective. And we do expect that these new rules will take effect on July 1 of next year. And then finally, and these are just some general perspectives that I'll share with you about the draft regulations. It should be said that they really do represent a big change in accreditation policies and procedures. And of course, when accreditation changes, campus policies change as well. And so there's a link between, proposed rules or regulations that the department will presumably set into place, what accreditors are then required to do in order to remain recognized by the department, and then what institutions in turn are required to do because of what accreditors require of them. So, make no mistake about it, there are going to be some major changes that you'll hear about in just a moment. Secondly, this is, I think it's factually indisputable, but I'll just say that it's certainly our perspective as an organization that there's some of the things that accreditors are going to be asked to do under these regulations, assuming they take final form similar to what's been agreed to, will create a certain amount of redundancy in the accreditation process to the extent that some of the things that the accreditors will be required to do are things that other entities, including institutions, are already required to do under law. So as a result of that, and reflects this next bullet on the slide, despite some claims that have been made, and I'll be curious to hear if any of the panelists have any perspectives on that. From our point of view, we do think that these rules will add cost to institutional activity. That there are some areas and ways in which the process will be expedited for new accreditors to become recognized. Keeping two accreditations simultaneously will be facilitated through these regs. But there's a lot of additional requirement that will be imposed upon institutions as a result of these, from at least from our perspective. And then lastly, I feel obliged to just present to our members that the Higher Education Act says very clearly that the Higher Education Act does not authorize, permit is the word here, the Secretary of Education to establish criteria for accrediting agencies or associations that are not required by this section. And some of the provisions that are included in these regulations, should be viewed in the light of that statute. Okay, so that's a lot of overview and talking on my part. I'd ask. I guess I'll ask participants if they have comments about this. Jennifer is a negotiator and a Nasiki veteran. Do you want to kick things off and make some opening comments?
Sure. I mean, I think you presented everything really well. I would add a couple of things. I do think, and this is true, as you sort of pointed out, this is true of every negotiated rulemaking. Um, any Department of Ed will put forward sort of what they want out of something. This department put together a very robust, and I think some of us view sort of extreme starting point from which we had to work. And I would just say, from a process standpoint, the negotiators are motivated to try to reach consensus with administrations a good chunk of the time, because if you don't reach consensus, and I did want to just add this, if you don't reach consensus, the agency can write whatever they want. And so there was a deep concern among the negotiators that if we didn't reach consensus, the department would go back to its original version, which was more extreme than where we landed. And so that was sort of that's always the difficult piece of negotiated rulemaking, and this one in particular. David, I agree with what you said. Unlike the other rulemakings the department has done as of late, with those were driven by the one big beautiful bill. They were required to create new regulations to implement statutory language. That was not the case here. However, I would say that it's been a while. They rewrote the regs a few years ago, not they, Biden folks, a few years ago, but this is probably the most robust rewrite on accreditation. And as somebody who sits on Nisiki, I would say, I'm not saying it was successful necessarily in all eyes, but I do think there, in theory, I don't begrudge the idea of doing a rulemaking on accreditation because the regs are stale, or the regs were stale. So those are just some process points. We'll get into the meatier issues, but I did want to mention.
Monty, as another negotiator, do you want to offer any perspective?
I think you and Jennifer have done a great job of covering the broad perspective of the work. I think the point that I would highlight, David, is the one that you brought forward a second ago that relates to um, having the two-year college mission represented at the table. Uh, there is not an element of accreditation that isn't in some way, form, or fashion mission oriented. And to begin to think about accreditation and the standards having been regulations having been agreed to, written, etc., by those that are largely from the four-year perspective, has been part of the hamstring that we have had as a sector for many years. And so, while many of our accreditor friends out there, the institutional accreditors, have softened that impact, this gave us an opportunity to be at the table. And we'll talk about some of those elements a little bit later and some of the impacts that we were able to have. But I just want to point out, David, how important it is for our mission to be represented in these discussions, going back to your point in terms of selection from the department. But overall, I think an experience that I would encourage those of you who have not participated, if you have areas that you feel like you could contribute in, don't be afraid of negotiated rulemaking. It has many times been described to me in a fashion that did not make me want to participate. Let me just say it that way. But certainly, once you get around the table and begin to understand the quality of the individuals around the table, the quality of the dialogue, and you absolutely learn so much. I can't even begin to put into terms what I was able to learn in that 2 weeks. It was really quite an experience. But I simply want to leave this body with an understanding that I believe it's important to note that we were represented at the table. And I also think it's important, David, to continue that mantra that two-year colleges need to be at the table for these discussions.
Thanks, Monty. Marla.
Sure. Thanks, David. And thank you for having HLC as part of this conversation today. We appreciate it very much. HLC is the largest institutional accreditor, and about a third of our membership are community colleges. So we are very focused on the impact for this particular group. And it's just so important to make sure that our institutions are educated about these issues so that they can make their voices meaningfully heard in the process, because that's really the most important thing at this point is to make sure that comments are heard, so that to the extent that there are concerns, things that need to be clarified, that institutions can make their voices heard in the process. I know we're going to go into the detail of all of these in some detail in a moment, so I won't talk specifics for the moment. I just want to reiterate, though, that your point, David, that requirements for accreditors become requirements for institutions, and that point cannot be lost. I think that we even with the variety of implementation across different accreditors, and there certainly will be variety of implementation across different accreditors, I don't see a world in which these regulations won't require significant implementation efforts and resources at institutions. You talk about adding cost and complexity, and that's true, I think. The reality is that accreditation can be complex, and that's okay sometimes because our institutions are complex and they are doing complex things for students. And we want to make sure that we offer proper quality assurance over that. But what we really just want to keep our eyes on is to make sure that that complexity is actually contributing to meaningful quality assurance in service to students. And that's something that I think is really important for AACC members to keep an eye on as they think about how they want to make their voices heard in this process.
Thank you. Dean, as you contemplate these regulations and the process that we've just described a little bit, I mean, how do you see it at a 35,000 foot level impacting your institutional activities? And as Marla said, ultimately it's all about the students and improving the quality of what we offer our students.
Thanks, David. First, I want to thank AACC for facilitating this conversation. I think it's important, it's timely. The way that you frame the question, it's more of I'm sitting here as a practitioner, as a president. What am I looking at as the challenges that are ahead of me? I don't disagree that this is a needed action. So to Jennifer's point, yes, they were stale and they needed attention. And I'd like to think that none of my colleagues would not agree that we care about student success, we care about program viability, we care about spending resources so there's a return on the investment. So to me, I think it's a leadership challenge over the next few years that one will be attentive to understanding what the definitions are for those as they are implemented by our various institutional accreditors. There will be work. We're going to have to change internal processes, I think, each of us to achieve compliance with these new standards. And then just a very basic observation, and I challenge each one of my colleagues out there, go do a deep dive into your institutional website, your catalog, your program handbooks. A lot of us are still using the language of regional accreditation, and that doesn't even work today. So I think that there's just some basic housekeeping in our processes that we may overlook along the way. But thank you, David, for the time that you're giving to this topic today.
Great. Thanks to all of you. And now let's dive into a variety of topics that are outlined and addressed in the draft regulations. And that is the term of art for where we are right now. The draft regulations have been approved by the negotiated rulemaking body that Monty and Jennifer sat on. So the first issue, a critical issue, one of the very most important ones is student outcomes. And the Higher Education Act is very succinct in its delineation of what accrediting bodies need to do, and therefore what the department needs to do in the process of recognizing those accrediting bodies. And it's one sentence, in fact, that is in the Higher Education Act. The proposed regulations, however, would require accreditors to go into much greater detail and depth and simply be much just elaborate more about what they actually need to do to address student achievement. And some of those features are on this first slide here. I have the Higher Education Act right in front of me, so I'll just read that as well. One of the standards that the accrediting bodies need to have of the 10 standards is success with respect to student achievement in relation to the institution's mission, which may include. And that's essentially the guiding language and the extent of the guiding language. It's in the Higher Education Act, which the department is required to follow as it recognizes agencies. However, in the draft regulations, the department and negotiators have agreed to that the broad student achievement standard has to be applied to individual programs, and that in the programmatic review, retention, completion, graduation, and the extent to which grades meaningfully reflect student learning all have to be examined and taken into account. And, I put in quotation marks the extent to which grades meaningfully reflect student learning, because as most of you are aware, a lot of attention has been given to grade inflation on campuses, but I'll let the panelists comment on that as they want to. But perhaps even more significantly, not necessarily a change in worldview or practice for community colleges, but certainly a new regulatory requirement coming through accreditation is that post-completion or graduation outcomes, including employment and continuing education, must be assessed, as well as educational economic returns aligned to the credential level. And we know, we're talking about the critical aspect of the way that these various terms are applied in practice, and certainly educational economic returns, are very potentially far-reaching terms in the sense of how you might implement those or operationalize those. Involves a lot of devilish details. Economic returns is something that institutions as well as accreditors have at times been challenged to identify the data that they would like to have in this regard. So it's really a sea change in terms of with the formal regulations that the accreditors will need to comply with. And I'm asking Marla, with that very brief overview, to talk a little bit about what these new student achievement standards might mean, how you read them in the draft regulations.
Sure. And thank you for the introduction, David. I want to build on something that Dean said a moment ago, is that we can all agree that we're in agreement on quite a lot, right? So accreditors, like institutions, are laser focused on student success outcomes, and from a data perspective as well. But I want to make two overarching points, and then I'll kind of go into the specific elements that I think are important to talk about with respect to the draft regulations. One of the hallmarks of accreditation, of course, is that the outcomes are going to vary by institution, by institutional mission. HLC uses the language mission reflective, but the idea that mission impacts what an institution's outcomes are is important. And part of that mission is, of course, an understanding of student intent, which is also going to influence outcomes. The other thing that I think is a reality from a practical perspective is that different institutions have different data capabilities and capacities. And so we need to make sure that we are meeting institutions where they are and then requiring continuous improvement from there. So we need to understand that different institutions are starting with different data perspectives from the get-go. As you mentioned, David, there certainly is a clear requirement in the draft regs that there be student outcomes at both the institutional and the programmatic level. So that is an important fact that we just want to make sure that everybody understands. There is a requirement for specific minimum expectations. Now, what those minimum expectations are and who sets them, whether it's the accreditor or the institution, I think remains to be seen. And that's part of what we would be seeking some clarity for as we move forward. And then if the accreditor is setting those minimum expectations, how much can institutional mission affect that? There are actually 5 specific elements that are required in the regs. 2 of them are kind of detailed here in the second 2 bullets on this slide, but I think it's worth it for the folks to just understand what those 5 elements are. It's state licensing and certification exam results, which is something that most folks are considering today. Retention, completion, and graduation rates, and that focus on grades, the extent to which grades meaningfully reflect student learning, and also support progression through the program of study. So there's a little bit more than just meaningfully reflecting student learning. It's a progressive thing. Post-completion and graduation outcomes, of course. An interesting one about scores on standardized tests for activities following graduation, which we can talk about in a moment, because I think that one can be a little bit challenging, perhaps. And then educational and economic returns, specifically as related to federal earnings data. Pretty clear what economic returns means, less clear, I think, what educational returns means. So that's something to take into account. Under any circumstances, that's a lot, right? So we are looking at a lot of new specific data elements. I think there's a question about whether all of these are clear. Again, not sure what educational return means, whether all of them are valid. That's the standardized test one. How does that relate to actually student achievement? Or even if they're possible, right? So if we're asking our institutions to know how their students who graduated years ago are doing on standardized tests, that could be a challenge for institutions. But even if we assume that all of them are a kind of a valid starting point, I think the reality is that institutions are not going to have systems in place at this moment in time to meaningfully collect and evaluate all of this information. And that's going to be a challenge. And institutions are going to need support from everyone, from the states, from accreditors, from professional organizations, to support them to build that data capacity in order to meet what, again, are accreditor requirements that become institutional requirements going forward. So curious to hear what my colleagues have to say about that as well, but that's my perspective.
Before I give them a chance to speak, let me put Jennifer on the spot. Jennifer, let's say that these regulations become effective on July 1 of next year and that they are largely the same as the ones that are on the table right now. How will those, Marla just described some of the new data and compliance elements that these, regulations would put into place. How is that going to be translated down to the College of Southern Idaho and other institutions? Just do you have a sense of what the timing
Yeah.
might be and how all that might sort of be implemented?
Yeah, and actually, I'll put a plug in for Nasiki is meeting next week, and I've asked. I assume it will happen. I've asked that we spend some time talking about what the timetable looks like, so that Nasiki will understand what that looks like. So that meeting is Wednesday and Thursday. It's public, so people can tune in if they like. But I think it's really important. I just jotted down a few notes. I think on your question, David, I think it's really important to recognize that although the impact, and nobody will question that the impact ultimately is on, almost equally on schools as it is to accreditors, because this is in the accreditation section and relates to the recognition of the accreditors. It's an indirect impact on the institutions in that what will happen next is that once these regs go into effect, eventually, and they won't go into effect until July of 2026, it'll take time for the accreditors to have their new standards in place. It'll be a while before they review their first institutions using these new standards. And eventually, there will be, not too far from now, but within a couple of years, there'll be an agency, more than one, agencies that come before NASIKI and the department for renewal. And we will start, members of NASIKI and the department will start sort of testing, if you will, the extent to which both the accreditor and their institutions have complied with the regulations. So it's still, and I'm not trying to say that people shouldn't get ready, because Marla points out all the data pieces. Sooner the better to start thinking about this, but it is a downstream in terms of impact. So, and I do have, David, a couple other comments if you want me to sort of
Please.
just based on the conversation. And I try not to occupy the airtime, although as Monty will tell you, I have a tendency to do that sometimes. One thing that we really tried to do as the non-federal negotiators tried to do is to contemplate what was already out there. And, you've talked about redundancy, David, and which can have a negative implication. But on the positive side, there are things that schools are already having to do. So this switch to programmatic, which we could debate whether the statute really even allows for that, because of the new accountability metrics the department has put into place, and just because, frankly, the marketplace is beginning to demand it, program-based outcomes is something that has become quite real. Regardless of regulation, it's already become fairly real. And so that piece of it, like if you're not already looking at that as an institution, yeah, you definitely need to be looking at it now but not just because of accreditation. The accountability metrics are coming your way, and that's at a programmatic level too. So the programmatic analysis piece requires a sea change, and it's an important one, but it's already embedded in other aspects of the marketplace and regulations. And so I think that's important to comment on. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is very, very purposefully, there were aspects of the law and the current regs that are staying in place. And in fact, the words "as appropriate" have been added in a few places on purpose. And so I think what we're going to find, and it's going to be hard for the Department of Ed to figure out what they meant, because there is still quite a bit of deference to the accrediting agency to determine what is appropriate for their institutions and their own standards. So there's a fluidity to this that I'm hoping, and so hope springs eternal, but that I'm hoping reflect what Marla's point was on mission, for example, that allows for that fluency and differences depending on types of institutions and types of accrediting agencies.
Thank you. We are running a little bit long. Monty or Dean, do you want to throw out anything or before we move on to the next topic
Oh, I
quickly?
think we're good.
Dean?
I do. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but it distresses me that the negotiated rulemaking is using grades as a proxy for learning, which I think is a longstanding debate in higher education. Most accreditors already expect that we have robust systems to measure learning through assessment. And I think that that's where the focus should be, that we have evidence of learning. And A is not a proxy for evidence of learning. And I think a lot of folks would agree on that. And then I would be curious, and maybe we'll get to this, the educational return for transfer associate's degrees, that educational return may not be evidence for years. And I don't know how we'll actually leverage evidence for the success of some of our AA and AS programs without a whole lot of data sharing. And to both Marla and Jennifer's point, those systems are not in place. I'll be quiet, David.
Can I
Okay.
just say that the
All right,
grading,
real quick.
okay, go ahead. The
I'm loving
grading
this.
The
Go
grading
ahead.
piece came from a negotiator, not from the department. And on things like that, I mean, I'm just going to give a tip. On items like that, I highly recommend putting in comments. That came from a negotiator and in the spirit of trying to get to consensus. So if there are nuggets like that, I highly recommend commenting on it because that was not the Department of Ed.
Duly noted. I'd already noted it, but it's noted a second time. Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, the next topic is a little bit less important to my mind and a little bit uniquely targeted or not so uniquely targeted rather at community colleges, which is faculty evaluation. And you can read the slide here, those of you who are on the call, but essentially the department is requiring accrediting bodies to have policies in place that relate to the evaluation of faculty. The second bullet on here, the regularly evaluated, maybe some kind of a reference to the, tenured faculty. And also the Jennifer's nodding her head. You can't see her on camera. And then the third bullet about the flexibility and instructional staffing policies. That also, to me implies that institutions somehow would would be short in some ways or not up to scratch in terms of being able to respond to the changes that are outlined here. So I slotted Dean to comment on this. Dean, do you want to say anything about what, from your perspective as a community college president, this might mean? I know there's not a whole lot of material here, and there is a little bit more in the reg.
We already have regular processes to evaluate faculty, and we don't have tenure, but essentially we have something similar. We regularly evaluate people throughout that process, and so I don't have any challenges or concerns about a process that expects evaluations, assuming it's not prescriptive with some sort of particular framework from an accreditor or the Department of Ed. I'd like to think that each of us are working with our faculty to make sure that they are performing at the levels that we would hope for them.
All right. Well, we have a couple other very meaty topics and a little bit less than 20 minutes, and I do want people to be able to watch at least the end of the soccer game, not myself, of course. And so let's move on to academic freedom and intellectual diversity. And this is an enormously loaded, fraught, complicated, topic. And there are two slides on this. I guess I'll quickly read through them, and then I'm just going to ask Jennifer to comment on them because she's an expert in this area. But as you all can read, the regulations require creditors to get into two new areas: academic freedom and intellectual diversity. These are areas that are not mentioned in the Higher Education Act. So this regulatory policy and proposed rule is being done at the administration's initiative. Jennifer, Monty, you may want to comment on this, that the issue of intellectual diversity and academic freedom became a little bit muddled in the conversations in NEGREG. You can see the third bullet on this slide here about academic freedom protections that accreditors must ensure. They go on to say that they have to be applied in these various, regardless of these various other criteria, which personally speaking, I thought was a little bit gratuitous. But that's, what the regulation, proposed rule says, or draft reg. And as others are more expert on this than I am, probably everybody on the other panelists, not to mention people listening, know about, the academic freedom as a legal and academic concept, but to apply it through the accreditation process is a new undertaking, and was met with a lot of reluctance by people in the academic community. Next slide, please, Jim. And then this next two bullets on getting into the academic freedom. You can read. I let people read this first bullet to take a minute to do that. And then the second bullet, it gets in this issue of intellectual diversity. And you're all aware of the controversies across academia and those critical of academia about the lack of intellectual diversity on campuses. So the draft regulations say that accreditors need to implement for institutions policies that prioritize intellectual diversity and the free exchange of ideas amongst faculty, which to my mind are a slightly different thing from intellectual diversity. And as you can read on in this bullet, that the accreditors have to implement policies that take into account student and faculty perceptions of whether or not there's intellectual diversity. So there's just a whole lot there. I'm not going to try to elaborate on it this moment. I asked Jennifer to give her perspectives on this, and any of the other panelists may want to offer them after Jennifer, because this is, again, a new area for federal regulation.
So, so it's kind of you to say that I'm expert. I don't fancy myself academic freedom or First Amendment, two things, but expert. And actually, one of the things that was lacking is actually an expert in this, true expert in this area at the table. It's really on this one, it's very important to realize how how pervasive this language was at the start of the negotiations and where we brought it to. I'm not saying I've never loved this language, so I'm not saying that it personally that I love where we landed, but it was highly negotiated. And one of the things that keep in mind, from my understanding, talking with accreditors, is that actually a fair number of accrediting agencies actually already do have some language around academic freedom in their either in their manuals or their standards. In some contexts, they do sort of contemplate the concept of academic freedom, which gave me a little bit of ease in my thinking as we were approaching this language. We zeroed in from a negotiation standpoint on putting as much of this language as we could into the context of faculty evaluation rather than in other places. The department had it literally all over the regulations, and we tried to bunch the language so that it's contextualized around faculty quality. And so, um, and in doing so, our hope is that it's kind of in keeping with what expectations are already of faculty. And of course, faculty support academic freedom. They preach it. And ditto on intellectual diversity, although that's debatable, from a political standpoint. But that was the overarching sort of strategy, if you will, on the part of the negotiators. I don't know how this flies long term in terms of, well, both in terms of whether it sticks just long term, and again, another area for comment, but also, what the long term implications are, how the department kicks the tires on this, I think is really, I would say, not entirely clear because it is new. This one is definitely new.
Thank you. Other panelists, you have any perspectives you want to offer on this? Monty, you were at the table. I don't want to put you
David,
on the spot.
I would just
Okay.
add the clarity around the notion of academic freedom. What I've experienced in 30 plus year career is the phrase academic freedom is broadly misunderstood on the college campus, and oftentimes becomes an element of personnel discussions when it never should be. What I think we will ultimately get out of this is a much stronger definition of academic freedom with a much broader understanding by more people within the organization as to what academic freedom truly means, and ultimately becomes lesser and lesser a part of our personnel issues. That is a minor accomplishment in the bigger scheme of things. Please know that. But I do think it's important to recognize the academic freedom element and then the intellectual diversity. The, to Jennifer's point, not only did we hear that reality in the initial proposal, but we heard it quite directly from the undersecretary to begin comments. It was clear that this was a direction that the department was very strongly in favor of, and one that there were quite a number of people around the room as negotiators that were frankly excited to have this discussion as well. I think ultimately we landed maybe not in the best place, but certainly in a place where we can manage and with a strong working relationship between accreditors and the institutions, I think we can result with a better, stronger set of faculty evaluation processes than what we have historically had.
David, I want to add something here, if that's okay, quickly.
Sure.
The I think part of the difficulty of this conversation is that we are simultaneously having policy-based conversations and more detailed conversations about language and implementation. And those two things are, in some senses, are very different. I think that there are laudable goals about academic freedom and potentially even about intellectual diversity that the department was trying to accomplish here, and that the regulators were doing their level best to honor and further. Just even looking at this second bullet, though, from a practical perspective, from those of us who will need to be implementing this, and then again, requirements for accreditors become requirements for institutions. I think it is very complicated to understand what a policy that measures student and faculty perceptions on the range of viewpoints and perspectives offered by the institution means. The policy needs to measure these groups' perceptions on all the different viewpoints, or David, you said maybe on the fact that there is a range of viewpoints. I just think, and this again goes to definitions, but some of this language is very complex and will be very challenging for accreditors and institutions to implement from a practical perspective.
Thank you. I'm going to move on, but those were all really interesting perspectives and helpful to me. Okay, next, I at least want to get through the two more topics. The First Amendment and related legal requirements. I mean, community colleges are public institutions, so we're subject to a variety of the legal structure as a result of that. The accreditors would be, you can read the second bullet, that standards, policies, and enforcement practices must not restrict public institutions from fulfilling their responsibilities under the First Amendment. There's a lot of sort of political backdrop to that we don't need to go into now, but I'll just leave it at that. But that the notion that, accreditors would have stood in the way of institutions fulfilling, at least public institutions, those responsibilities is certainly an important dynamic that the administration was addressing through this in the fashion that it did. There's also this has a more of a specific reference, I think, to some things that occurred a couple of years ago, but that, I mean, you can see here that accrediting agencies, Marla, maybe you want to talk about this, but that the agencies are prohibited from reviewing institutional governance of public institutions that are established by state law, when governance is, as everybody knows, is something that accreditors have routinely taken a close look at, and for good reasons. And I mentioned here that there, a number of these areas, and this is a very telegraphed version of what's in the draft regulation, that certainly First Amendment protections are something that public institutions are already required to comply with, and bringing creditors into this is arguably unnecessary. So with that as a really quick overview, Marla, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, and I will be quick because I know we're trying to move through a lot of topics quickly. I think this goes to, David, the point about redundancy that you raised early on in the presentation. It goes without saying that that accreditors can't violate the law and that we can't ask institutions to violate the law. It seems a little redundant to say that. However, if that's what Ed is looking to say, then that's what should be said here. I think one concern that could lead to some confusion and complexity and cost is that rather than just simply saying follow the law or don't require folks to break the law, there then is a lot of language in the draft regulations that offers a restatement of the law, which would be Ed's interpretation of the law. And I think that adds a lot of complexity because it's not just follow the law, it's follow the law, which we are saying means this. I think there were efforts made to respect religious mission throughout the language, which is again a laudable goal. I do think that the end result here is that accreditors are being asked to evaluate religious mission in a way that they have not been asked to do before, which could also raise its own concerns. And then I just want to mention kind of this last point about refraining from viewing aspects of institutional governments of public institutions, which I think obviously was, as you said, has a long and sort of sordid history to it. I'm not entirely sure what that phraseology means. And again, that's kind of a running issue throughout everything. HLC's perspective, and I think the perspective of other institutional accreditors as well, is that we are one part of the triad and that we need to be implementing our rules in a way that respects the other parts of the triad. And I think that broader goal, again, is an important goal and really should have been and should be going forward the focus of the conversation, not this kind of very narrow issue. It's this idea about respecting roles across the triad. So I'll leave it there.
I think in the interest of time, we're just going to move on to the last topic that we're going to have time to address, and that's transfer of credit. Somebody just sent me, it's halftime and the score is 0-0. Thank you, Dory. Thank you for that, for that update. Much appreciated. We are going to maybe run a few minutes over, but we will make the slides available to everybody. And this last topic that we will at least discuss is probably the most important, at least most directly, uniquely relevant to community colleges. Um, I do, before we get to it, I do want to make a plug for, and you'll see this on the slides that come forward, that we are doing a webinar on July 29th on the workforce Pell implementation. There's a QR code a couple slides down that you can use to register right on site or right now. And then the other thing, some that I want you to know is that a number of you on the call, I know, have been at our Advocates in Action meeting in September. We are doing it again this September 15 and 16. I encourage all of you who have an interest in public policy to come to this just 2-day meeting in DC. We have most of the scheduling done, and we have just a great roster of presenters, as well as giving you an opportunity to help us advance our agenda on Capitol Hill. The middle of September means that we're approaching the end of the fiscal year, and there are a lot of really important things that we're going to be working on then. Most importantly, the funding issue and Pell Grants. So I wanted to just mention that before we get to the close of the webinar. And just to, transfer of credit. So transfer of credit is, of course, supremely important to community colleges. The rules that were agreed to require a significant new change in policies by accreditors and therefore institutions, again, as Marla has mentioned a couple times. And I know Monty was very involved in negotiating these provisions. They historically, AACC has been a little bit reluctant to see the federal government getting involved in this area, but given the lack of full progress that we've made, and given the fact that we're not where we would like to be as a sector in terms of our students' academic credits transferring, and without necessarily saying what our position absolutely will be in the comments we make, we do look favorably upon these provisions, but make no mistake about it, they represent a dramatic change and a dramatic new set of requirements on institutions as they admit students and how they process the transfer of credit. So this has been a very top priority for the administration from the start. Again, as the second bullet says, this goes well beyond what the Higher Education Act itself requires. The fourth bullet on here talks about the need for institutions to set specific academic standards and time limits and curriculum requirements for acceptance. Institutions have to elaborate a comprehensive statement of all transfer of credit policies, and will include the comparability of coursework completed in another institution. You want to next slide, please, Jim. This is I'll just let people read these, take a minute to just read this first long bullet. But as you're doing that, let me just mention that the institutions are going to have to provide a written rationale for denying transfer of credit, and also the time that would be needed to replaces the courses for which credit was denied. And students will have some appeal rights here as well as outlined on this slide. As I mentioned, these provisions, which were a big priority for the administration, were substantially modified in the neg-reg process. And I would ask Monty to talk a little bit about what you think this means for community colleges and any reflections you might have about how this was handled in the 2 weeks of neg-reg.
Sure. First of all, let me say, going into the negotiated rulemaking, this was a key element that we wanted to focus on. And in particular, the direction that we were hopeful to take was one of more of a consumer protection kind of approach. The reason for that is 25 or 30 years ago, we were developing guidelines that gave students the kinds of flexibilities that are written into these guidelines. I negotiated 29 of those in Virginia. and all of them were exactly the same. So how is it that it took us from 2005 to 2026 and we have unevenness across our institutional transfer opportunities, where a student who transfers from one two-year college to a university may receive a different kind of credit, a different amount of credit, may have additional credits required to complete degrees? The fundamental issue here is we are concerned that there are four-year institutions there who won't transfer students and who work desperately for them. And there are many four-year institutions who turn a blind eye to transfer students. We wanted to make sure that if institutions said we're going to be a transfer institution, we're going to treat students at a certain standard. And largely that was accomplished. Look, the language that was proposed initially is not the language that was approved. But frankly, many of the registrars and those involved in the detailed processes weighed in and pushed back. In fact, organizations that we are members of, like ACRO, were not excited about this change because of the significant impact that it would have on the registrar's office, on transcript evaluation and moving transcripts back and forth between institutions. I urge you to think about this as an opportunity for us to build a better mousetrap in terms of transfer. We didn't get the full 10 steps of approval that we would like. We got 2 to 3. Let's grab those, run with them, and show some improvements in transfer. Ultimately, I think data sources like the National Student Clearinghouse are going to be incredible beneficiaries in this work, because we will be beneficiaries of their work because we'll have an opportunity to tell that broader transfer story. David, the last point I'll make here, there is clear evidence that our colleagues around the nation believe that a baccalaureate degree is the door to the middle class. Frankly, if that's the case, the treatment that our two-year college students have received on large from our university colleagues does not reflect universities that are supportive of building America's middle class. It instead suggests that many of our students are treated in a manner of pushing them away from the middle class. We wanted to be darn sure that these guidelines made it clear that the federal government supports transfer and the federal government expects institutions to treat students according to a certain guideline.
Thank you. Strong statement. Panelists, you want to offer your perspectives on this?
Well, I just want to say this is an issue that I've been involved with for decades. And David, I think we've agreed a fair bit over time on this issue. I think that this may singularly be the most important legacy of this rulemaking. I know that the other pieces, we will see how they flesh out. This one's actually fairly clear in terms of what the expectations now are for institutions and accreditors. So, and I think it adds so much transparency and clarity. Well, I hope it will add transparency and clarity to students, which is really the most important, to know whether what credits will transfer in an appropriate time frame to when they transfer. This is one where I think a lot of us around the table were quite pleased with where we ended up.
Well, I'm
David,
glad
you
to
and
hear
I
you.
have,
Yeah, please, Dean.
oh, no, I was going to say you and I have known each other for a while, so this is going to be one of the briefest comments that I could ever make. Ditto. Ditto.
All right. This next slide simply, I felt compelled to put it on here because it does add a new requirement that might prove daunting for institutions about the cost benefit analysis that accreditors have to make. And I just don't know. We have a couple, a current and a former president here. How easy it will be to conduct a cost benefit, analysis, or at least provide one for the accreditors, assuming they're not doing it themselves. So this just underscores the fact that the implementation of this language, will, potentially mean for a lot of new practices on institutions. Cost benefit analysis is kind of an old term at this point. It's not used much anymore, but this review, if the department means what it says, could mean a lot of work by both accreditors and campuses in terms of, whether a given expenditure, can the benefits can justify financial, administrative, and opportunity costs. That's a complicated balance that would need to be taken into account to make that evaluation. But we're well over time, and I think in the interest of consideration of our panelists and attendees, I'm going to bring this to a close now. I do just want to, we had one more slide, Jim, if you want to just move on to that, please, about some of the general accreditation process. I was going to ask Marla to speak to that, but these aren't quite so immediately relevant to our colleges. So I don't think we'll take time to go into that. Did just want to thank everybody, first of all the people who listened in on this, because we do think that it's very important for our campuses to know about these changes. The panelists did a fabulous job of, I think, putting some specific examples and perspectives on, what these regulations might mean. This is, as I mentioned a minute ago, this is our, if you want to quickly take with your phone, take a snapshot of this. This is the QR code to register for our next webinar. We'll be sending you the slides of this, so this will all be available to you shortly. And I just want to thank everybody, because we put a lot of thought. Dr. Pollard was our president and CEO is not able to be with us, but she encouraged me to organize this webinar and does send her regards. And I just want to thank everybody for, I think, giving a really good picture of what we're looking at in these regulations. Our AACC's comments will reflect a lot of these statements that have been made. And just know that you can be in touch with me on any of these items, and you'll easily be able to contact any of the panelists as you like. And so just want to thank everybody once again, and please come to Washington in September for our Advocates in Action meeting, and stay in touch with us. Thanks, everybody.